Welcome everybody to this online event entitled "No One is Safe Until Everyone is Safe: Global Perspectives on COVID-19 Vaccination." My name is Bastian Hermesson. I'm the director of the North America office of the Heinrich-Böll-Stiftung in Washington, D.C. And I would like to welcome you also on behalf of my colleagues in our EU office in Brussels, together with whom we are hosting this event. At this point in 2021, there is hope in many countries that widespread vaccination against COVID-19 will bring the long-awaited pandemic relief. Much now depends on the outcome of the race between a mutating virus and vaccines to end the pandemic. However, the dire truth is that many countries may have to wait until 2022 or beyond before vaccine supplies are widely available. And yet, ensuring rapid and broad global access to vaccinations is not only essential from a global justice perspective, but also from the perspective of global health. In light of this, our foundation has commissioned a series of country and regional studies written by authors from the global South and East. They shed light on different realities and give recommendations to European and US policymakers. Today, we will discuss these issues with policymakers and experts from the EU, the United States, and South Africa. Before we get started, I would like to make a few technical remarks. Firstly, as many of you know, you're welcome, and I encourage you to use the Q&A tool at the bottom of your screen to ask questions or add comments throughout this event. We value your input and look forward to your questions. Secondly, I want to make you aware that this event is being recorded and will be made available on YouTube, just so that you're aware of it if you do pose questions that they might be made publicly available. And lastly, for a run-of show and what you can expect over the next 90 minutes, we will start this debate with a keynote speech by the co-president of the Heinrich-Böll-Stiftung, Barbara Unmüßig, followed by our distinguished panel discussion, and then by a round of Q&A. We will also include 2 videos from experts in South Africa and Colombia that will be screened as part of the program. And with that, I'm very glad to hand it over to Barbara Unmüßig for an introduction into this important topic. Thank you very much for joining us, Barbara. The screen is yours, and I look forward to your remarks.
Thank you very much, Bastian, for having me here today. Ladies and gentlemen, dear guests, dear friends, dear colleagues. I very much would like, first of all, to thank our Washington and our Brussels office for facilitating this debate, commissioning the country studies, and launching the web dossier. Thank you. I think it's very crucial and very important that the foundation shows from different regional perspectives what's going on the ground in the different countries who are not benefiting at all from vaccination policies. Let me start by saying that the current vaccine policy is not only a global health issue, but very much so a matter of social and economic justice. From my perspective, at least 3 bigger dimensions of justice are involved. The first one is definitely around global fair and just distribution of vaccines. The second one is related to the short, midterm, and long-term social and economic impacts if people are not vaccinated and economic recovery is at stake. The third dimension looks at the current global vaccination policy and how it influences and determines international relations and the perception of international justice and solidarity. To the first aspect, as you already said, Bastian, in Europe and the US, the pandemic situation is slowly easing up. We can enjoy our freedoms, socialize, children can go back to school, economic life is getting a boost. All this is made possible not because the pandemic is over, but because of the availability of a range of vaccines and the ongoing vaccination campaigns. In Germany, nearly 50% of adults have received the first dose, and the US aims to have 70% of its adult population vaccinated by July 4th. According to the to the World Health Organization, some 2 billion doses of vaccines have been used so far, 75% of them in just 10 countries. China, the US, and India have consumed 60% of all vaccine doses. Yet, in most countries of the global south, the reality is quite different. In Africa, the third corona wave with new virus variants is currently raging, in some areas worse than ever before. Less than 1% of the African population is fully vaccinated to date. The poorest countries have not received even 0.5% of the available vaccines. Such an uneven distribution not only leaves millions unprotected against the virus, but also allows deadly variants to emerge and circulate worldwide. In terms of vaccine equity, a huge gap between richer and poorer countries persists. It seems that if the old North-South divide is back, privileges for the richer countries at the expense of lives in the global south. The bottom line is that it moves us even further away from global and social economic recovery. For the majority of developing countries, the low vaccination rate is a disaster and will deepen the already tremendous economic and social crisis. Many developed economies could absorb this unprecedented shock using unconventional monetary policy and massive stimulus spending. This path was not open for many developing countries that have limited resources and institutional capacity to support their economies. The coronavirus pandemic and the associated economic fallout have exacerbated high debt levels in many low and middle income countries, hampering their ability to respond to the health and to the economic crisis, as well as climate-proof their economies. According to the UN, far more than 200 billion people worldwide could be driven back into extreme poverty by 2030. According to the Food Agricultural Organization, FAO, COVID-19 may have increased the total number of undernourished people in the world by more than 100 million in 2020 compared to pre-pandemic levels. The International Chamber of Commerce argues the cost could be as much as $9 trillion if developing countries are not given independent access to COVID-19 vaccines. Half of these costs would be incurred in developed countries. This is very much from my perspective, and I'm sure I share this with our audience. This is why a scale up of vaccine production and broad distribution of vaccines is both an urgent economic necessity and a moral imperative. Together with the World Health Organization, the WTO, the World Bank Group, and IMF have urged international support for $50 billion of financing aimed at achieving more equitable access to vaccines and thus helping to tackle the pandemic everywhere. The Kovacs Initiative, so many politicians refer to, the Kovacs Initiative was launched at the beginning of the pandemic for precisely this reason, among others. However, Kovacs is still not equipped with appropriate means and vaccine doses. Initially, Europe and the USA prevented this on the premises of Europe first and America first. Industrialized countries were buying up vaccines that were actually intended for poorer countries as delivery via COVAX. It was only early this year that vaccine shipments via COVAX arrived in several countries in Africa and Asia. But as early as April, some of the poorest countries were warned to expect delays due to sudden vaccine shortage. India, as COVAX's largest supplier and hit hard by the pandemic, was suddenly in need of international support itself. I think it's good news that the US manufacturer, Moderna, announced plans to supply COVAX with up to 500 million vaccine doses, most of which, however, Bastian mentioned this, would be delivered in 2020. We see COVAX ability to act depends on the favor of individual vaccine producers. And once they fail as suppliers, vaccination campaigns are in danger or coming to a complete standstill. I would like now also to address some aspects on how the pandemic and the vaccination policies influence and determine international relations. Now that their own population has been supplied with enough vaccines, one could almost say that a public image contest has started among Western countries on who will deliver most vaccines doses to the global South. The German foreign minister, for example, is even speaking of, quote, international solidarity in action, unquote, and boasts Germany as the second largest donor to the COVAX platform. Yet, the initial Western self-interest and COVAX unreliability have fooled the so-called vaccine diplomacy of India and China, both used in an early stage of the pandemic to increase their political influence by offering favorable conditions for vaccines to select friends and neighbors, and thus attempting to create new geopolitical influence zones and realities. The G7 countries recently decided to deliver 2.3 billion vaccine doses to poorer countries by the end of the next year. These steps come with plenty of delay, but I would say at least it comes. However, the announced quantities are far from sufficient. 10 to 15 billion doses of vaccine are needed to protect world's population and stop the spread of the virus. The later the rich countries share doses, the less time recipient countries have to vaccinate. To keep in mind, vaccines have an expiration date. In addition to much faster distribution of vaccines, it's essential to increase, of course, vaccine production. One way to do so is by lifting patents, licenses, copyrights, and other trade barriers. Unfortunately, we have lost a lot of time here. As you all know, last October, India and South Africa submitted a proposal at the WTO to suspend patent protection of vaccines, at least temporarily. More than 100 WTO member countries have endorsed it. And it came with surprise that the US government has broken out of the phalanx of opposing industrialized countries and is signaling now agreement. The EU is divided. The German government has been criticizing the decision of the Biden administration. Pharmaceutical companies are up in arms against it. And it's uncertain whether the text-based negotiations on the TRIPS waiver proposal that recently started in the WTO can result in the awaited suspension of patents. The pharmaceutical industry always argues patent lifting with high development cost for medicine and vaccines. But in the case of the COVID-19 vaccines, governments spend billions of euros in order to enable and to speed up the development of the vaccines. I think it's more than adequate to put conditions on such enormous public funding, especially in global health emergencies and humanitarian crises. Vaccines should not be a commodity, but rather be considered as a common good. A further agreement of the vaccine manufacturers and politicians supporting them is that vaccine production is too complex to rapid replication in developing countries. Yes, it is technology and knowledge intensive, but there are enough potential manufacturers in the world. a group of health experts recently suggested that companies in South Africa, Senegal, and Egypt could quickly retool factories to produce mRNA vaccines if they get access to the technology and to the know-how. There are also world-class producers in Asia and Latin America. And of course, successful and sustainable pandemic response must include a whole range of measures. The international community must join forces urgently to provide developing countries with all the necessary materials for vaccination campaigns and testing centers. We need contingency plans to deal with viral mutations and supply shortages, as outlined in the recently released joint plan by IMF, World Bank, and the WHO. The plan also states clearly that any obstacles for expanding vaccines supply must be removed. I emphasize once again, speed is of essence. Given the global dimension of this pandemic and the fact that the number of mutations is increasing worldwide, we must overcome our selfish national interests. Successful pandemic response requires coordinated global action based on coordinated decision-making, fair and transparent vaccine delivery processes, and know-how sharing. This, for me, would be real solidarity in action. I thank you very much for your attention, and I'm listening the debate, the upcoming debate. Thank you once again to Washington and to Brussels for having me here today for this important debate. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Barbara Unmissig, for those comments and for this framing of our discussion. You have touched upon a number of important issues that we will discuss further in the following panel discussion. And with that, I would now like to introduce our distinguished panelists. I want to welcome Anna Cavazzini, who is a member of the European Parliament for the Green Group in the EP. She chairs the Committee on the Internal Market and Consumer Protection, and among other functions, is also on the Committee on International Trade. Thank you for joining us, Anna. And I know you will have to leave at 4 p.m. Central European time, but we're very glad to get to hear from you before then. I would also like to welcome Ignacio Garcia-Bercero. I'm trying my best on pronunciations, hope it's okay. Mr. Garcia-Bercero is the Director for Multilateral Affairs Strategy, Analysis and Evaluation in the DG Trade of the European Commission in Brussels. And for those of you who don't know him, anyone who's worked in trade probably does, he is basically Mr. Trade Policy in Brussels with decades of experience. Welcome and thank you very much for being here. I'm also excited that we can be joined by Catherine Bliss, who is a senior fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, DC. She has a long-standing expertise in global health policy and extensive experience in academia and government service. Thank you very much for being with us, Ms. Bliss. And I'm delighted that Zain Dangor can join us. He is the special advisor to Dr. Naledi Pandor, Minister of International Relations and Cooperation in South Africa, and joins us from Johannesburg. Thank you very much for joining us as well. And I would like to start with you, Mr. Dangor. Jointly with India, South Africa has been at the forefront with a proposal to suspend patent protection for vaccines, at least temporarily, in order to expand production capacities. How do you view the continued resistance to this proposal by the EU? Please, Mr. Dangor.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for having me. I trust you can all see me and hear me clearly. As you've indicated, and as the previous speaker indicated, South Africa did table the proposal in October 2020 for a TRIPS waiver, which seeks to remove the legal impediments to transferring knowledge, technology, and associated know-how to ramp up global production of vaccines and also diagnostics and therapeutics, with the goal of responding decisively and comprehensively to the global public health crisis. In essence, we felt that this initiative at the WTO was a means to halt the spread of the pandemic, and also to ensure that new variants do not emerge that undermines the earlier solidarity that we saw from the global world. This proposal has received wide support with over 100 WTO members indicating their support. This includes the African Union. Importantly, this proposal has received support from civil society around the world, precisely because they see this as a fundamental right to health and a right to life issue. And together with us, we agree with them that it's perhaps the most pressing human rights challenge facing humanity now. Given this and your question, it is therefore very disappointing that a number of WTO members, including the EU, Switzerland, the United Kingdom, Japan, have withheld their support for what is essentially a global human rights campaign aimed at saving millions of lives. Essentially what we see, that the essential objective of those opposing the waiver can be distilled as attempts to maintain the current regime that provides the exclusive rights for IP holders that in turn generates enormous commercial benefits for the firms and countries in which they are located. So what it appears to be is that the traditional champions of human rights, perhaps we should narrow it to civil and political rights, have foregrounded profit over lives and health, and this is disappointing. And I think we were waiting for more proposals from other member states. We see the EU has come up with some proposals that we don't see as an alternative to the WTO waiver proposal. We see it as a discussion that can be taken further after that, because I think countries in the global south have for a long time argued that the provisions for compulsory licenses under Article 39 is something that we should take up in the long term, and it will require intense negotiations. But right now, we are asking the EU, in particular, and to reconsider the manner in which they are opposing the waiver, to ensure that the asymmetrical production of vaccines in a few countries and the vaccine nationalism that emerged from that, leading to countries in the north having enough supplies to vaccinate their populations 4 or 5 times over in some countries, whilst countries in the south, including my own, have had to interrupt our rollout of vaccines, to the point where the fears that we spoke about last October already, the emergence of variants that will not only undermine our own global health initiatives, but will actually, in the long run, undermine perhaps even the global health progress and the progress made in the north through the vaccination program, because you might see the emergence of vaccines variants that make the effectiveness of the current basket of vaccines in Europe less effective. So for us, this is a human rights issue, and we are surprised at the continued intransigence by the EU on this matter.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dangor, and we will return to the EU side, who you particularly addressed in a minute. But first, I would like to turn to the United States and turn to Ms. Bliss. The US has signaled its support for a TRIPS waiver. However, many argue that this is only one of many factors in the drive to increase global vaccine distribution. We heard about that from Ms. Unmusik as well. Facilitating technology transfer, ramping up production capacity, or addressing supply chain constraints are among many additional factors. And how do you see the role of the United States in this complex setting? Over to you, Ms. Bliss.
Thank you. Last month, the Biden-Harris administration did indicate that it would support the proposal at the WTO from India and South Africa to suspend intellectual property rights protection for technologies needed to prevent, contain, or treat COVID-19 until widespread vaccination is in place globally and the majority of the world's population has developed immunity. Now, the proposed waiver could certainly be an important step in the quest to increase manufacture, supply, and regional availability of COVID-19 vaccines, which so far has been quite limited, with access to those supplies largely controlled by high-income countries. According to recent surveys, something more than 80% of the nearly 3 billion vaccine doses so far have been distributed in those high-income countries, with just 1% going to the lower and lower middle-income countries. And as an example, COVAX, the vaccine pillar of the Access to COVID-19 Tools Accelerator, or ACT-A, which is providing vaccines to the world's 92 lowest income countries through the Advanced Market Commitment, has only distributed 90 million doses so far. So if the United States and other countries that support the TRIPS waivers can generate enough support for the measure over the next several months, it could eventually lead to a more rapid expansion of manufacturing in regions like Latin America and Africa, where supplies are desperately needed, and help make them available at lower cost. But I think it's important to recognize that supply issues are just one part of a much more complex challenge. Access to, delivery of, and demand for the COVID-19 vaccines are equally critical parts of the vaccine equity equation. So, first, let me say a little bit more about supply. COVAX, the global facility, held a pledging conference back at the beginning of this month and secured an additional $2.4 billion in funds. But, as was discussed earlier, even with funds secured, it's currently low on access to doses, in part because so much of the facility's supply was contracted to Serum Institute of India, where the surge of cases this spring led to restrictions on exports and diversion of vaccines for domestic use. Many of the lower and middle income countries have also struggled to strike separate purchase deals kind of beyond COVAX with manufacturers of the vaccines that have been approved. Some countries, as in Latin America, have turned to the Sputnik vaccine distributed by the Gamaleya Institute in Russia, but not yet approved by regulatory authorities like the World Health Organization. Others in Latin America and sub-Saharan Africa have turned to the Sinopharm vaccine made in China, but it has perhaps lower efficacy than some others, so people are already talking about the need for additional boosters, adding cost and complexity. And then there's the problem of delivery. Since the 1970s, the World Health Organization has worked to support the routine delivery of childhood immunizations, with Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, since its founding in 2000, supporting routine immunizations, primarily for children, too. In recent years, particularly with campaigns to distribute the Ebola vaccine in sub-Saharan Africa, there has been a focus on immunizations for adults, but for the most part, global programs do focus on children. So countries are having to adapt their programs at this time to maintain routine immunizations for kids, while also figuring out how to engage adults who may not be used to going to health facilities, certainly for vaccines. At the same time, country immunization programs don't necessarily have adequate storage or cold chain capabilities for the new 2-dose vaccines, and now they have to train health workers to deliver the COVID-19 vaccines, either by using existing personnel within immunization programs or by recruiting new providers. And then finally, there are issues of demand and confidence. In places where there hasn't been a big impact of COVID-19, populations may be skeptical of the need for vaccines, or even if there has been a significant number of cases, they may have been exposed to rumors or misinformation about COVID-19 vaccines, or feel afraid to go into a health clinic to be immunized. At the same time, in places where there has been conflict, people may be wary of government officials coming in to deliver vaccines, or just say they have other compelling health needs beyond COVID-19. So I think it's really important to address all of these supply, access, distribution readiness, and demand issues at once, even before the vaccines arrive, so that there can be a smooth rollout once they are there. And I think as far as the US is concerned, the United States is supporting COVAX and bilateral immunizations with funding, technical support, and coordination with other donors and implementing partners. And I think it's important that the United States share lessons from the domestic vaccine rollout and the tough challenge of vaccine confidence here in the United States as well.
Thank you very much, Ms. Bliss. a range of issues beyond the supply that you have also opened for this discussion. And with that, I would like to turn to Mr. Garcia Becerra and allow you to react to some of the issues that have been raised, including by Mr. Bangor, that particularly address the European Union. The EU has come out, as we know, with a counter proposal to the TRIPS waiver that we also mentioned earlier. And I was also wondering and ask you to address what that entails and how that would address the dire global need for more vaccines. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for having me here. I will try to be synthetic because there are many issues that have been raised in the debate so far. Now, the first point would be to emphasize that if you actually want to respond effectively to the fundamental challenge that we are facing in terms of equitable access to vaccines, you need to take a holistic approach. You cannot just focus on one particular aspect of the equation. Now, I will only talk on those issues which are relevant for the WTO, but of course, there are many other issues that go beyond what the WTO is competent on. But in the WTO, we, and together with many other members, believe that a holistic response needs to include at least 3 issues: how to keep the supply chains open, how to encourage the expansion of production and of exports at low cost, and of course, the issue of intellectual property. Since many of the questions that have been raised relate to our position on intellectual property, I would focus primarily on that. But let me stress that if you really want to achieve increased access to vaccines, keeping the supply chains open, encouraging the voluntary agreements between companies to license technology is extremely important. I would say much more important than the issues relating to intellectual property rights. So what it is concretely that we are actually proposing on intellectual property? First, in terms of legal instrument, we propose a declaration, like was indeed the case for the Doha Declaration that introduced all the elements of flexibility into the intellectual property regime. And to be very, very frank, I will very much disagree with what my colleague from South Africa has said. One of the key advantages of a declaration is that it can actually be much more rapid and more quickly effective than a waiver. Now, if we were going to agree on a waiver, this would imply that all of those countries that have domestic legislation on compulsory license would need to modify that legislation to take into account the new conditions relating to the waiver. Instead of that, what we are basically saying in our proposal, let's clarify the flexibilities under TRIPS. Let's have as broad as possible reading of the flexibilities under TRIPS to make sure that those countries that consider that they need to issue a compulsory license can do it in a manner which is rapid and which is effective. And that's basically what our proposal is intending to do. And to simplify things, let me just work on an example. Now, it has been pointed out that some countries like South Africa and certainly others probably have manufacturing capacity to produce certain COVID-19 vaccines. Of course, it might in some cases be difficult to do it without entering into agreements relating to the licensing of technology. But let's assume that despite that, a number of countries have actually the capacity to produce vaccines, and that the only obstacle for them to do so is intellectual property patent protection. What we are basically saying is, first of all, there should be no question whatsoever that a country which is in those circumstances is perfectly legitimately entitled to issue a compulsory license. And I say that because sometimes there have been criticisms that we or others have been actually objecting to countries issuing a compulsory license. We want to be absolutely clear, in the circumstances of a pandemic, it's a perfectly legitimate instrument to issue a compulsory license. Secondly, there is the question of a speed. Sometimes the argument has been made that it is difficult because in order to issue a compulsory license, you need first to negotiate with the right holder. Again, we want to make extremely clear that no such negotiation is needed in any case while we are actually experiencing the situation of a pandemic. Then what is the other obstacle which is sometimes being mentioned? The remuneration that you actually have to pay to the right holder of the patent. Again, we want to encourage the production of vaccines and the export of vaccines at the low price, or indeed at cost. And we are making very clear that this inevitably implies that the remuneration to the right holder would also have to be a very low one to take into account this objective. And to be very clear, all of these are flexibilities that are not limited to vaccines, which indeed could apply to any product. Beyond this, we also want to tackle the issue about how to ensure that these vaccines are not only for the domestic market, but are available for export. And again, we want to be very clear, this can be done in a very, very simple manner. Let's assume again that we are talking about a company in South Africa who wants to supply the entirety of the African continent, or indeed beyond the African continent, countries which have no manufacturing capacity, as it's indeed the case for most countries in the world. It should be able to do so very simply on the basis of a simple notification indicating all the countries to which these vaccines are going to be exported. Now, those are ideas which are very concrete, which are very practical, which could be agreed and implemented very quickly. And by the way, we have made clear that we are, of course, open to discuss other elements. Just to give you an example, sometimes it has been mentioned that the problem is not only patents, but it is also what is called regulatory data protection. Now, this has to do not so much to the issue about the authorization to manufacture, but the right to export. But if there is a question relating to regulatory data protection, again, we think that the exceptions that apply in the context of a pandemic imply that it should not be an obstacle to the production or export of vaccines or other medical products covered by a compulsory license. So we have tried to put on the table something which, quite frankly, is practical. We are certainly ready to engage in discussions to come to an agreement as rapidly as possible. And what I would like to be very clear, it has nothing to do to supporting the profits of the European pharmaceutical industry. Actually, if you have seen the statements made by the European pharmaceutical industry, they are certainly not very happy with our proposals, which are actually intending to facilitate and to recognize the legitimacy of compulsory licenses. This is all about being effective, being practical, about trying to do something which can't respond to the concerns that have been expressed about, in some cases, patent being an obstacle for the expansion of production. As I said, we don't think it's the main obstacle. We think other issues are much more important, but it should be part also of a holistic response, which is what we favor.
Thank you very much for laying out that approach by the European Commission. Anna Cavazzini, I think it is fair to say that in the European Parliament, there are some different views on the way that the EU should go than what the Commission is currently proposing. For example, the Parliament is backing a temporary COVID-19 vaccine patent waiver. So I want to turn to you and ask, do you think the strong message by the Parliament has been heard? How do you see the negotiations to continue, and how do you judge the current European approach? Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Bastian, and also to the Böll Foundation in general for this event, but also for the very good and well-founded work on the vaccination issue for the last months. I think it is very, very important that stakeholders like the Böll Foundation bring also together different people, different perspectives, also from the Global South, and make those voices heard in the debate here. So thank you for that. Let me just say that I am also of the opinion, similar to the statement of Barbara Unmüßig, that it is first a question of justice and of international commitments like the SDGs, like the commitments to eradicate poverty, but also a question of self-interest to get forward with a better global distribution of the vaccines, because we see now with the Delta and also other variants that if we are not careful, if we are not eradicating the COVID virus around the world, then it will basically backfire. So there is two really big reasons for having a better global distribution of vaccines. And Barbara Unmüßig mentioned very well at the beginning the numbers. I don't have to repeat them, but we see that it's really outrageous how badly distributed the vaccines are at the moment, and we definitely need to solve this problem as fast as possible. I think there is also a third reason that was mentioned. I don't think it's the most important one, but nevertheless, other countries, I would probably also, or some people call them rivals, are even better in the global distribution of vaccines and put their labels on. So even as a matter of geostrategy, it could be important to have a better distribution of vaccines, but this is only the third reason for me. I want to be very frank with you. I'm very, very disappointed of the European Commission and their approach. It started already from the beginning. Very early in the process, the European Parliament or individual MEPs have asked the Commission really right at the start of the pandemic on the question of intellectual property rights. And we always, for the last couple of months, heard the same mantra. No, the existing framework is perfectly well suited, and okay, we have COVAX and this will solve everything. Then with the pressure from the European Parliament, but of course also with the international developments, the Biden administration speaking out for a TRIPS waiver, there is finally now an EU proposal. But this came off only after months of repeating and repeating that there is a problem and that we need to look at the current framework of intellectual property rules, which are not suited for a pandemic. So we lost so many months. And I would say still the proposal that is on the table by the Commission that was just also presented again is, to my mind, more a distraction strategy, because if you look at it, it's basically reinforcing the existing rules. We know from the past couple of years that compulsory licensing are really, really complicated to ask for, to get it on the table. For developing countries, almost impossible to negotiate. And I, to be very honest, don't see in the EU's proposals so much of concrete improvements. And it is clear that it's more of a position, of distracting from the TRIPS waiver. And I think this is very unfortunate because we, again, losing time and losing more time and losing more time. I think it would be really important that the EU Commission also basically listens to the European Parliament. And Bastian, this is what you have been saying. The Parliament had actually voted twice on supporting the TRIPS waiver, once in the resolution on AIDS, HIV, and that was a couple of weeks ago. And this is also interesting because if you look at what happened in the AIDS, HIV crisis, you clearly see that patents, that intellectual property rights plays a huge role in access to medicine. And what happened at the WTO level and the TRIPS flexibilities and so on only came into assistance because of a huge campaign by NGOs, by health NGOs, by countries like South Africa. So we see really a parallel here. And then again, we had an own resolution on the access to COVID vaccines in the last plenary session, or like in the pre-last plenary session. And the problem is that we don't have any like legal say because it's international negotiations, it's WTO law. So the Parliament doesn't have a legal leverage to force the Commission to take a position. But of course, we have a very strong political cause. And I think also from a democratic point of view, I think it is really not very good that the Commission is ignoring the European Parliament's position in that, because of course, we are elected by the citizens of Europe. We're the only directly elected democratic body in the European Union. And if the Commission is just ignoring our political position, this is of course not very good and doesn't create a lot of trust. So let me conclude this first round by saying I really want the Commission to accept the TRIPS waiver negotiations and to take a proactive role in the negotiations like the European Parliament has asked for. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna Cavazzini. And before we do another round on the panel to also continue the conversation, I would like at this point to turn it over to two short video statements from two of our authors of the dossier. And again, the dossier was posted in the chat as well if you want to read further. And I'm really looking forward to hear from their perspectives, because as we mentioned, it is so important for us to bring in voices and perspectives from the global south and east of what the situation on the ground is like and what the need is like. The first of these videos will be from Lauren Paramore, who is the co-author of our South Africa case study. And the second will be from Diana Guarnizo Peralta, who is the co-author of the case study from Colombia. I want to thank both of them and all of the authors for their contributions, and film off.
Good day to you. My name is Lauren Paramore. Along with my colleague at University of Cape Town and People's Health Movement South Africa, I co-authored the case study that Heinrich-Böll Foundation commissioned on COVID-19 vaccine access in South Africa. One way to summarize the situation in South Africa is to say that the government has secured sufficient doses to vaccinate 60% of the population. It's done so through bilateral deals with Pfizer and Johnson & Johnson. And if we stop here, it might seem that that's a fairly good situation. However, what we've seen in recent days is that it's in fact a quite precarious situation. And I say that in light of the contamination of Johnson & Johnson vaccines that took place at its Baltimore manufacturing plant. And so this has significantly impeded the vaccination rollout in South Africa. And I think it's also illustrated quite dramatically the consequences of the limited manufacturing base for COVID-19 vaccines globally. And so it's in light of the artificial supply constraint created by limited manufacturing sites for COVID-19 vaccines that we in our case study call strongly for the global community to support the COVID-19 intellectual property waiver submitted by India and South Africa in October 2020 at the World Trade Organization, and subsequently supported by many more member states of WTO. In particular, we call for the waiver to be supported in its full form, so in other words, to be supported for IP waivers with respect to vaccines, but also diagnostics and therapeutics, and also for the waiver to apply not only to patents, but also to trade secrets, copyrights, and industrial design. And so this is not something that's sufficient. Alongside this, there should be political pressure to ensure that greater equitable distribution of existing vaccines in the supply pool takes place. But certainly we believe that a core component of increasing vaccine equity is to ensure that more states in the global south are able to build their manufacturing capacity for COVID-19 vaccines during this pandemic, but also for future pandemics. And in this light, the legal certainty created by the TRIPS waiver is an important step, an important first step towards that outcome. Thank you.
Colombia, as many Latin American countries, have seen the devastation of the pandemic, both in terms of human lives and also the economic impact. Currently, Colombia reports almost 600 deaths daily, and the poverty rate has increased by 7 percentage points in the last year. We need to increase the speed of the vaccination quickly, but it's hard to do as there is massive scarcity of vaccines around the world, and the few available have gone mainly to high-income countries. At the Justicia, we believe this scarcity is artificial and is mostly a result of the excessive protection of intellectual property laws in international law. We must acknowledge that, as any other legal construct, IP laws must be flexible in order to protect a most important objective, which is global health. Many organizations from the Global South have been calling high-income countries to support the temporary waiver to patents and other intellectual property rights of vaccines and treatments of COVID-19. This measure will allow companies from around the world to replicate vaccines, therefore increasing the global production. The waiver to patents is just a first step that must be accompanied with the due transfer of knowledge and the necessary investments in technology that allow a more decentralized production. It should be also temporary and allow fair compensation. Other measures, such as promoting voluntary licenses with companies and increasing the donations to poorer countries, are important. But let's be clear, these actions will not be enough to deal with the pandemic. Companies have been reluctant to engage in voluntary licenses, and vaccine donations are still a drop in the ocean. Poorest countries need a more decisive commitment from the high-income countries and not just charity. As Latin America and India are the current focus of the pandemic, we make a call to high-income countries to, first, support the waiver of IP laws on vaccines and treatments related with COVID-19, facilitate the transfers of knowledge and technology to poorer countries, and, in the meanwhile, increase the donations of vaccines, medical supplies, and medicines to the poorer countries. Solidarity and cooperation cannot be just a slogan. We need to prioritize health over greed.
I want to thank Ms. Paramore and Ms. Gornito-Peralta very much for their contributions, shared both in those videos and also in the pieces that they wrote for our dossier. And with that, would like to bring it back to our panel. I think also a lot of points have been raised in these videos that you would probably want to address. Just waiting for Anna Cavazzini to sign back on, actually, who had a little bit of internet issues. And so would first like to turn to Catherine Bliss again. The video statements, I think, make clear that there is growing frustration in the global South with countries like the US and also the EU about their efforts and role in the global vaccination campaign, but also on other issues like technology transfer. And so production of vaccines is really only one side to that. I was wondering if you had to design a US diplomatic vaccine strategy, what would it look like under those circumstances? If you were in the White House right now and in charge, what would you suggest?
Well, I mean, yes, one of the most significant criticisms of the United States and the other G7 countries is that they have overly focused on meeting domestic needs and ignored or downplayed, at least until very recently, the importance of supporting vaccine supply and delivery in the lower and middle income countries. Now, the United States authorized the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines in late 2020 and began offering doses to health workers and elderly populations right away. Then in February, the Johnson & Johnson vaccine received emergency use authorization. And by mid-April, with the transformation of football stadiums and convention centers into mass vaccination sites, some 3 to 4 million people a day were receiving COVID-19 vaccines. But now that rate has slowed quite a bit. There's still a significant percentage of the population, maybe 15%, who really doesn't plan to get the vaccine at all. So the story now is about excess supply, doses, expiring and empty delivery sites. Now, last December, the US Congress did make a $4 billion commitment to the COVAX Advanced Market Commitment through Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, for the procurement and distribution of COVID-19 vaccines to the 92 lower and lower middle income countries that are eligible. But it wasn't until March of 2021, really 3 months after vaccines began to be distributed domestically, that the US really made the first announcements about donations of surplus or excess doses to other countries. And actually, those first donations were actually loans of AstraZeneca vaccine, which had been contracted under, what the production program called research and production program called Operation Warp Speed. But, AstraZeneca vaccine, is not yet approved in the United States. So these loans were made to neighboring countries, Canada and Mexico, where domestic regulatory agencies had approved it. So shortly after that, I guess in April, the Biden administration announced a commitment of 60 million doses, pending a safety audit and export clearance of million, with a large number to go to India, where at that time cases were climbing. And that was followed then by the early June announcement of the intent to purchase the 500 million doses of the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine for distribution through COVAX bilaterally. Now, the 4 billion commitment to Gavi makes the US the largest donor to COVAX. So the US has a strong interest in making sure COVAX is successful. That includes using technical and diplomatic resources to secure additional financial commitments for COVAX from other countries, and working through bilateral and multilateral channels to encourage donations and support. We may see additional bilateral or regional commitments along the lines of the AstraZeneca loans to Mexico and Canada, or it might not be surprising to see a focus on regional security or trade partners, for example. But I would really think that those would complement the commitment to COVAX, not take the place of it. So if I were, diplomat in chief, I'd want to make sure that all ambassadors or chiefs of mission were consulting with host governments to determine their views on the state of COVID-19 outbreak, response, and vaccine rollout, for at least 3 reasons. 1, to understand country needs and to offer support if needed. 2, to encourage support for regional and global vaccine donation, supply, manufacturing, and distribution initiatives, including COVAX, and also to gather information on other country experiences that can inform US approaches and strategies as well. Now, bilateral programs and technical assistance provided through the US Agency for International Development and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, I think should be focused on supporting countries in their work to continue routine services, routine immunizations, be ready to deliver COVID-19 vaccines when they're available, and to promote communications to ensure vaccine confidence. And at the same time, I think in the midst of this current crisis, US overseas efforts must also be directed at helping countries anticipate and prepare for the next pandemic to strengthen their abilities to prevent, detect, and respond to outbreaks of infectious disease, and to anticipate the next set of global health challenges. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Bliss. And with that, I would like to turn to you, Anna Cavazzini, again. I don't know if you had a chance to see the videos. I think you had no, I see you're shaking your head. Okay. Basically, they were covering a lot of ground, but one common theme was, again, the fact that intellectual property laws are important, but at the moment they're being applied in a manner that favors intellectual property protection over a decisive and equitable global response to the pandemic. So I do want to turn back to this point on the one hand to you, like what should a policy design of intellectual property protection look like that at the same time, is effective in the pandemic response? But I would like to also add another question to that, because after that, I know that you will have to leave, which is, and this has been alluded to by Barbara Unmüßig, also by Catherine Bliss and others, which is, how do you feel the EU is doing when you look at this as COVID diplomacy compared to actors like China, like Russia, or like the United States in demonstrating to its partners around the world that it is a reliable partner, and that it's effective also in providing the support needed by other countries. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. And sorry, I had an internet problem. The European Parliament's internet sometimes doesn't work, so I'm now in with my personal hotspot, but I think it's working. And you mentioned it already. I have to excuse myself already. I have to leave a little bit early because I'm having some basically committee-related meetings now. Yeah, I think what is really important, we say it in all policy fields, but I think it is especially important in the field of intellectual property rights. We need to draw lessons from the pandemic and also really try to see what we can change in the future. And I think, as you mentioned, and I think what probably also was said in the videos, that the intellectual property rights system that we're having now is probably not fit for purpose. And I think what is interesting to think about, can we have a system where we, of course, keep the innovation, because this is what we always hear when we talk about the TRIPS waiver, when we talk about creating a better environment for the global distribution of vaccines, that we need to keep for the pharmaceutical companies, of course, an incentive to innovate, to invest, and so on and so on. But I think this can be combined. I think there is very interesting models around that combine exactly these two needs of making sure pharmaceutical companies still do research and invest and so on, but on the other hand, having a better system for a global access to medicine, and especially when we have a pandemic, to vaccines and so on and so on. It was mentioned before, but I think it's really important to reiterate that so much public money has been already going to developing of the vaccine. This is, of course, direct support of the companies. That is also basically public money in buying the vaccines, for example, sometimes to overpriced doses. For example, when you look at Israel, that bought much, or that paid much higher prices than the European Union. But it is, of course, also the general research that had been going on for years, that had been done at universities and so on and so on. So I think the first very much most important condition is tying public research to access, because of course it cannot be that we publicly fund the research and the developing of a vaccine and then privatize at the end the gains, the revenues. So I think there should be harder conditions on public research. I think there can be also, in times of crisis, a mechanism where, sometimes something is developed like a vaccine, and then you can just even negotiate with an individual company and saying, okay, we pay you thus and thus money, and for that, your invention becomes a global public good. So this is another model, I think, especially working in the pandemic. There's very interesting ideas, like, for example, price incentives that, for example, governments say, okay, we need this and that medicine, and if the company delivers research on that or develops this medicine, then we just pay for it. So there is, I think, very interesting alternative models to the currently existing intellectual property rights model, where you also have a lot of different flaws. For example, we see a lot of companies sometimes patent minor improvements, minor developments, that a medicine that is already on the market for years is just tweaked a tiny little bit, and then you get a new patent for another whatever, how many years. So I think it is important to draw the lessons from the pandemic, don't continue with business as usual, and develop a system that allows, of course, companies to thrive and also probably to make profit, but on the other hand, make sure that medicine is accessible for all, because it is a human right. And I really hope, and this is my last sentence, that also the European Commission takes the lead in thinking out of the box and not continuing with business as usual, and driving the debate on what can be done, probably in the framework of the WHO. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna Cavazzini, and thank you also again for joining us for this debate, and all the best for your next sessions. Before I turn to Mr. Garcia-Becerra and Mr. Dangor, I would like to remind all of you that the Q&A tool at the bottom of the screen is open, and I very much encourage you to add your comments or questions so that we can take them up after we finish this round, because we greatly value your input and opinion. And even though we're all zoomed out and only digitally connected, we like to make this as interactive as possible, of course. And with that, I would like to turn to Mr. Garcia-Becerra, again from the EU Commission. So Anna Cavazzini has mentioned also the question whether we do not need long-term changes in how we approach this, also beyond COVID-19 generally. And I would like to address that to you, also to have you react to the videos that you saw and the statements from Colombia and South Africa, and to combine it with one last point of mine, which is that this commission has labeled itself to be a geopolitical commission. So it has, pronounced the ambition to be a geopolitical actor. And in this sense, what we've heard in the videos, and also what has come across in the studies that we have commissioned, is that the perception in many countries around the world is not exactly one of EU leadership in this global crisis right now, as it would be needed. And how do you see this, and how do you think this geopolitical ambition could be strengthened? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And I would like to start by your general question, and then to get into the more concrete issues raised by the videos. I think you need to combine the capacity to react as quickly as possible to the immediate necessities of trying to facilitate equitable access to vaccines. And for that, you need to use all the tools which are available, but you also need to reflect in the more medium term how to ensure that production of vaccines is more equitably distributed in the world. Because it is clear that a situation in which only in a very limited number of countries there is the capacity to manufacture vaccines is not a situation which is sustainable. And that's the reason why the European Union has also been very much working with the African Union to see how one can develop the capacity to enhance production on vaccines and other essential health products in Africa. And indeed, not only in Africa, I think the necessity is also very much the case in Latin America and other parts of the world. So that is the medium-term challenge. Now, at this point in time, what is critical? What is critical is, first of all, that all the countries that have the capacity to produce vaccines are ready to share and are ready to export their vaccines, including through vaccine donations. The European Union has been the only major producer of vaccines, apart from China, that has basically exported half of its domestic production. I think the more that other vaccine producers begin to share their domestic production, the better that would be in terms of favoring equitable access. We also need to do all we can to encourage companies to enter into agreements to share that technology. Because we should be very, very clear. We should have no illusion. No waiver of intellectual property rights is going to force a company to share its technology. If we wanted to encourage technology cooperation, that needs to be based on agreements between companies, but this has to be very strongly encouraged and supported by the public authorities. And having said that, let me again say that when it comes to the issue of intellectual property, the more that we can be concrete on the discussions, and the more that we can actually identify which are the actual obstacles that countries which have the production capacity may have to increase that production, which are linked to intellectual property rights, the more that we can actually be very concrete, the more that we should be able to produce a response which is effective and which is rapid. And let me just clarify a few points. First, we have been very clear in our proposals that we cover not only vaccines, but also diagnostics and therapeutics. So contrary to what has been the position of the United States, what we are suggesting would go beyond the issue of the production of vaccines. Now, I think that we all agree that the critical intellectual property rights when it comes to the production of essential health products is patents. And a waiver of a patent is fundamentally a compulsory license. Now, we have been putting very concrete ideas about how to facilitate the issue of a compulsory license. Now, if there are some other elements relating to the issues of a compulsory license beyond what we have suggested, we are very happy to have a discussion to see what concretely can be done. But let's be as concrete as possible, because we tend to get sometimes bogged down in a bit of an ideological debate about the intellectual property right system. Now, I heard that in the videos there were also references to other intellectual property rights, like, for instance, trade secrets. Again, let's be very clear. No waiver of intellectual property right is actually going to force a company to share an information which it considers to be a trade secret. What I think is always possible to discuss, if a trade secret is available, what are the exceptions to the trade secret legislation which can be considered? And this is, by the way, recognized under the intellectual property agreement. And I also understood that one of the issues that was argued in the videos was about the importance of legal security. Now, very happy to have a discussion on that, but let me just make an argument why we think that the declaration, like was the case of the Doha Declaration, can be much more rapidly provide the legal security which is needed for countries to begin to implement those flexibilities rapidly. If we are going to be waiving the intellectual property rights, that can only be done and implemented domestically through changes in legislation. If we have a very broad reading about the provisions of the TRIPS on compulsory licenses, that will make it very clear that any domestic authority can implement this legislation in a very, very broad manner, which is what I think would be more effective and more rapidly in terms of responding to the situation that we are facing. I believe that we are certainly engaging in very concrete text-based discussions in the context of the discussions in Geneva. And I hope that the more that we are practical, the more that we actually try to focus on what it is that is going to facilitate the issue of a compulsory license if a public authority thinks that this is needed. And I certainly understand that that may be the case in some countries in the global south. The more that we are very concrete, the more that we should be able to make rapid progress on this issue.
Thank you very much. And with that, I would like to turn to Mr. Dangor, go back to Johannesburg and South Africa, before we turn to some of the questions and comments that you have posted in the chat. And again, please continue to post your questions and comments. Mr. Dangor, when we look at South Africa in particular, many experts say that South Africa does have the vaccine manufacturing capacity that could produce a considerable amount of additional vaccines, not just for the country, but for the continent as well, provided that there is sufficient transfer of technology and know-how. From your country perspective, what is needed to best achieve that kind of large scale and fast technology transfer to rapidly increase production on the ground?
Thank you. So to borrow the words from one of our CEOs of one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in South Africa, Aspen, recently when the French president visited South Africa and a loan agreement was announced, what the CEO said was, what we need is know-how, technology transfer, and not necessarily money. The money we can leverage ourselves. What we really need is the technology transfer. That is the biggest impediment. So South Africa does have the capacity within various companies, but also the region has the capacity that if we do have the technology transfer to produce not only for domestic use, but also for regional use. So the biggest impediment is actually IP. It is the technology transfer issues. This brings us back to the important issues that we've been discussing thus far about whether we go for the broad scope of the IP waiver proposed by South Africa, which includes trade secrets, copyrights, industrial designs. Because if you waive those, you actually waive the onerous conditions in 39 and 39 bills required for compulsory licenses. So in order to scale up, we need, and in order for companies to invest in repurposing their plants to produce mRNA-based vaccines, or even some of the other forms of vaccines that are on the market, they need the security and the certainty that there will be no countermeasures in order to produce for domestic use and also for the region. So, you know, the idea that the problem is only linked to a deficit in use of the existing flexibilities under DRIPS is one that South Africa and India came into because of the experience since 2001, since Doha. You know, the experience since Doha has shown us that the provisions under the DRIPS flexibilities are very onerous. We are willing to engage in a discussion with the EU and the European Commission. Are they willing to waive every single one of those onerous conditions under Article 39 and 39 bis? which we in the Global South have been calling for years, and for many years have been ignored, including the previous pandemic under HIV and AIDS. I think this particular pandemic, because its impact has been more global than HIV and AIDS was, has brought to the fore the need for this discussion, even in the global north. So for us, yes, we will be able to produce. We have the capacities. There's a scoping of what are the unused capacities in Southern Africa, the whole of Africa and other parts of the world, including Vietnam, Korea. And what we really do require is letting go, waiving the IP on a temporary basis, but not a limited approach to it. A broader approach that includes undisclosed information. And there are provisions within the WTO that once we do have this kind of waiver in place, that may compel companies to share trade secrets. So it's a question of where we start, and we start with the waiver, and we move towards what happens if companies continue to refuse to share undisclosed information necessary for ramping up in a pandemic, so that companies in the South can invest in repurposing for domestic use and for exports. You know, for us, the key issue is security of supply. And the current paradigm, the current status quo have shown us that even when we've ordered significant, as was indicated in the video, purchase the vaccines, it's precarious because there's a supply issue. The major problem facing us in the South and many in the North is a supply issue. We cannot assume that continuing to depend on a few companies located in the North is going to give us the kind of security of supply to beat this pandemic and also to prepare us for the next pandemic.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Dengo, if I can just stay with you actually for one of the questions from the chat that goes in a very different direction. The question is COVID actually, or should it be the highest public health priority of African countries compared to tuberculosis or clean water systems and others, considering that the median age of many African countries is quite low? And why are the vaccines thought as a must for the whole population of African countries, rather than the countries that maybe have a somewhat older population? So how do you look at COVID compared to other public health challenges when you look at the continent?
Look, getting into a discussion on what the hierarchy of our responses should be on the public health challenges is a tricky one. I mean, we do have significant issues with malaria, tuberculosis, access to clean water, and in fact, the conditions, inequalities exacerbate the spread and severity of COVID in Africa. But right now, we have a massive problem with the rapid spread of COVID throughout Africa. We've seen it in South Africa with the over the last few weeks, the spread of the Delta variant, and we can assume that that's going to be a case for many other African countries. And it's something that we should respond to right now and make the necessary investments. But it doesn't mean that we do not invest and continue to improve in meeting the other public health challenges. This is an issue that the AU and the CDC is engaging on. We also see that preparing ourselves and ensuring that we are well prepared to meet future pandemics such as COVID will also assist us in dealing with the ongoing health challenges around TB, malaria, HIV and AIDS remains major problems for us. It also means that we need to look at the issues of living conditions, access to clean water, dealing with poverty, dealing with inequality. But right now, we have to face with what's facing all of us and in South Africa and the region, which is COVID, which is decimating the economy, but also taking the lives of people en masse.
Thank you very much. There is one comment in the chat that I would like to try to turn into a question for Mr. Garcia Bethero, which is that there was so much public funding provided for the development of some of these vaccines of private pharmaceutical companies. Pfizer was given as an example, but at the same time, some of these companies are still making use, according to the comment, out of tax havens and not, providing, paying their fair share of taxes in many of these countries. So I wanted to ask to you how this is being debated in the Commission, also in light of the current that the Biden-Harris administration in the US reinvigorated transatlantically on global minimum taxes, etc. If you have such a massive push of public funding towards development that is in partnership with companies, how are you debating then the responsibility of those companies to the public?
Yeah, no, well, I think there has been certainly a lot of public funding that has been given to pharmaceutical companies, both in Europe and in the United States. There have also been, I would say, a very rapid and successful development of vaccines and the expansion of production in record time. This being said, it is clear that it is not enough, and that's why we in the European Commission have indicated that we very much expect companies to be able to enter into more licensing agreements to share their technology, that we very much expect companies to commit to be able to supply their vaccines at cost or at a very low price to countries which are in need, and that's something that we are satisfied that at least some initial steps have been taken by some companies. But let me again stress one very, very important point. I mean, no waiver of intellectual property rights is ever going to force a company to share its technology. If you actually want to encourage sharing of technology, you need to be able to find ways of encouraging countries to do so. One, of course, it is also possible to put pressure on companies, and we understand that one of the reasons why countries have considered the use of compulsory license is precisely to increase the pressure on companies to enter into licensing agreements. That is perfectly legitimate, and what I want to be very clear, because I have been listening carefully to what has been said by Mr. Danger, we believe that the proposals that we have actually put forward on the table make it extremely easy for the authorities of South Africa or any other country to make use of a compulsory license if that's what they think that is what they need to do at any particular point in time. Quite happy to discuss this in more detail, quite happy to see where there are other elements relating to the issuance of a compulsory license that need to be discussed. But certainly, that should not be the argument that we are somehow threatening countries with countermeasures if they use a compulsory license. We have made very, very clear that this is a perfectly legitimate tool in the context of a pandemic, and that if South Africa or indeed any other country in the global south considers that the discussions with pharmaceutical companies are not delivering the necessary results in order to enter into licensing agreements, and they consider they have the manufacturing capacity, we certainly find it's perfectly legitimate to issue a compulsory license. There is no need to negotiate with the company to do so. There is no need to be particularly concerned about the remuneration for the buyholder, which can be extremely low, and it should be possible to export without bureaucratic obstacles to any country which lacks manufacturing capacity. I mean, that's what we are basically proposing, and quite frankly, I would really like to understand what else it is that countries think it is necessary to be able to make sure that patents are not an obstacle for the expansion of production.
Thank you very much for that comment and response. And with that, due to time, because we could continue to discuss this for a long time, I would like to pose one of the questions in the chat to Ms. Bliss and connect it to the final round, actually. The first question that was posed in the chat was, how much, what level, what percentage of immunization of the world population do you think is really necessary for an effective COVID response and also global economic recovery, especially if we consider the current mutations of the virus. But I would like to combine this question with my final question also for the final round, which is, we're now at the end of June in 2021. And if you are thinking about a year ahead of now, the end of June of 2022, right now we are at a situation where there is this vast disparity between different countries on questions of vaccinations, on questions of economic recovery, on a whole range of issues. If you think about a year from now, where do you think we might be a year from now when it comes to these disparities and when it comes to also effective global vaccination distribution, storage, development, production, etc.? Ms. Bliss, please.
Well, I hope that a year from now or a year and a half from now, we have, as a global community, taken advantage of the time that we have to adequately prepare and be, ensure that people are, health systems at, from the national level to the community level are ready and available, not only to deliver vaccines to people who need them, but to strengthen, people's access to the broad range of health issues that have been neglected during this period, that, people have been in quarantine and at home and away, afraid in some cases to go to health facilities. I mean, we know that there's an entire backlog of access to health services that will need to be addressed, along with the vaccines that are being distributed and the many other health issues that some communities may frankly think are more important to them than access to vaccines. And so I think it's important to not only anticipate, prepare for, and ensure a smooth delivery of vaccines when they are available, but also really prepare health systems for ideally a return of people to those health systems to address the many health issues that have been neglected, and to ensure that vaccines are really part of a wraparound, I guess, set of services that can address a holistic sense of people's needs, and not just this one vaccine for a disease that they may or may not have really had emphasized in their communities.
Thank you very much. Mr. Garcia-Becerra, back to you. If you think about a year from now, where would you like to have us be, and what do you think is realistic where we might be a year from now?
Well, I hope that 1 year from now, in terms of vaccination, we will have reached a situation in which globally the vulnerable population has been vaccinated in all countries, and that there's enough flexibility in the way that vaccines are being distributed to make sure that there can be a very rapid response whenever there is a surge of infections. Because one of the things that we are seeing with variants is that the situation can vary very quickly, and a country which initially appeared not to be exposed quite quickly can develop a very dangerous situation. So I hope that 1 year from now we have reached that point. I hesitate to talk about global herd immunity because no one is really very clear about what global herd immunity actually implies. Now, from the policy point of view, I really hope that we can get as quickly as possible an agreement on a holistic response to the immediate concern relating to COVID-19, but that we also start building up the policy responses which are important to be better prepared for the next pandemics, including ensuring a more equitable and broader distribution of production capacities, because it is very clear that in the future we need to avoid a situation in which only in a very limited number of countries there's the capacity to produce vaccines.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Dangor, what is your outlook to the future?
Well, I hope that in the next 6 to 12 months, we can move away from the acceptance of a philanthropy-based global health system to one that actually deals with systemic change, so that we have security of supply for life-saving medications being produced in the global south for this pandemic and for the next one. I think for too long we've depended on a system of philanthropy-based global health policy and the distribution of life-saving medications. And since Doha, and this is a very important discussion to take place, I think that we hope that we can find common ground with the European Commission and others around the immediacy of ensuring security of supply, immediacy of ensuring that all barriers to people accessing life-saving medication in other regions in the South and in Africa takes place as soon as possible. And that, you know, we sit around the table and look at what should we do? What is and I think the colleague from the European Parliament put it, is to find the balance between innovation and an appropriate regime for the production and dissemination for life-saving medication now and in the future.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dangor, with that, those hopeful and important last words. I want to thank all of our panelists for taking the time out of their busy schedules to join us today. I also want to, again, particularly thank all of the authors of our country studies that have contributed to the online dossier, which you can find in the chat function. And I hope you give some of these articles a read. It's truly worth it. And I want to just finally say that we, as the Heinrich-Böll-Stiftung, will continue, of course, to cover the pandemic through a lens of global and social justice, not just when it comes to vaccines and vaccine distribution, but also when it comes to the economic recovery, for example, particularly when it comes to also gender equity as really a core topic that has always been pressing, but has become an even more pressing one over the course of the last year. We will also, as a Böll Foundation, continue to provide space for perspectives and voices from the global South and East in this debate, and encourage you to have a look, have a listen, follow us on social media and online. I want to thank again also my colleagues in the Brussels and DC office who did all the heavy lifting on not just this event, but the dossier, and also our global offices that helped us in this endeavor. We strongly believe that we need a more equitable distribution of vaccines because, as the last year has shown, no one is safe until everyone is safe. And with that, the last word goes to our co-president, Barbara Unmüßig. Thank you. Barbara, please.
Sorry, Bastian, it was a mistake. I just would like to clap my hands and say once again, thank you very much to all the panelists for all those contributing to these great country studies, etc. So in that respect, once again, thank you very much, Bastian, for all your convening power, for moderation, and say hello to all your colleagues in Washington, and hello to those in Brussels. Thank you very much to all panelists, and stay safe and healthy. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.